Hi all, hope we're safe and well today. What we're going to be moving on to is looking at the fourth of our anthology poems today, which is Before You Were Mine by Marilyn. Once again, we're going to be using the Mitzel grid for our analysis, looking at those 5 sections of meaning, imagery, tone, structure and language. I hope this is really useful, and as we can hopefully be starting to see now, the collection of the poems have very similar themes, and we can start to make some links and connections and comparisons between them. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is just have a read through the poem and just to get some initial impressions of it. So, I'm 10 years away from the corner you laugh on, with your pals Maggie McGeaney and Jean Duff. The 3 of you bend from the waist, holding each other, or your knees, and shriek at the pavement. Your polka dot dress blows round your legs, Marilyn. I'm not here yet. The thought of me doesn't occur. In the ballroom with the 1,000 eyes, the fizzy movie tomorrows, the right walk home could bring. I knew you would dance like that. Before you were mine. Your ma stands at the close with a hiding for the late one. You reckon it's worth it. The decade ahead of my loud possessive yell was the best one, eh? I remember my hands in these high-heeled red shoes, relics. And now your ghost clatters towards me over George Square, till I see you clear as scent under the tree, with its lights, and who small bites on your neck, sweetheart. Cha-cha-cha. You'd teach me the steps on the way home from Mass, stamping stars from the wrong pavement. Even then, I wanted that bold girl winking in Portobello, somewhere in Scotland before I was born. That glamorous love lasts where you sparkle and waltz and laugh before you were mine. Okay, the first point we can make about this poem is that it is an autobiographical account from the poet Marilyn Duffy. So it's meant to represent a real incident or a real feeling that she has about her time as a child. The poem itself is about her finding a photograph of her mother as a younger woman out with her friends on an evening out in Glasgow, and the photograph shows them all laughing and dancing and shrieking at the pavement in hysterics. Now, what the photograph forces the poet to reflect on is that for her mother, potentially the happiest time in her life was before she, the poet, was born. So therefore this raises all sorts of questions about self-worth, about the relationship between a parent and a child, whether the child causes these restrictions to freedom that the parent has, or whether that changes their life completely, which is reflected throughout the poem. And we look at the poet's attitude throughout about how she's really insecure about that relationship, and she's not really certain about whether her mother made the right choice ultimately by having a child. The poem itself is focused on this moment, this sort of freeze frame, this capture that you have from the photograph, and the repercussions of that, and the image and what that represents as a moment, a turning point, if you like, in the poet's mother's life. Imagery-wise, there's some really interesting things going on in Before You Were Mine, and they reflect quite clearly the poet's attitudes and feelings towards her mother. One of the most prominent is your polka dot dress blows around your legs, Marilyn. Now, what this is meant to evoke is the image of Marilyn Monroe, which is quite a prominent idea, as we have the reputation for Marilyn Monroe being the most beautiful woman in the world, and it's meant to reflect a very iconic image of Marilyn Monroe standing above a steam vent and the dress blowing around her legs. So it's making these comparisons between her mother and Marilyn Monroe is implying the beauty and the glamour of the lifestyle that her mother has. Similarly, we have later on in the poem the poet playing with the shoes as a child, and she calls the shoes, high-heeled red shoes, relics. So it's suggesting that these shoes are from a different time, they're from the past, they're like museum articles rather than items of clothing. They're something that's from a different time, from the past. So that use of that metaphor there about the museum articles and the shoes is really quite an interesting one that you can get your teeth into and kind of think about why the poet's chosen to describe that. We have imagery, obviously, because it's based on a photograph, so we have the fact that they are holding each other and shrieking at the pavement. We can imagine this freeze frame of these women on a night out, and the sort of joy and unadulterated pleasure that they're feeling at that time, the sort of the best time of their life, if you like. Which is juxtaposed with an image later on in the poem where we have your ghost clatters towards me across George Square. So we have this idea of the ghostly memories of what's been going on, and the mother's past are evoked as well by that use of that metaphor of a ghost clattering towards the poet across the square. Probably one of the images that I really like to get into is the idea of stamping stars from the wrong pavement. So we can imagine the poet and her mother being taught the dance steps on the way to church, and the stars in the wrong pavement is meant to evoke this image of Hollywood. This sort of again linking it in with the idea of Marilyn and this glamorous lifestyle. The fact that the poet describes this as the wrong pavement suggests that it might have been the wrong decision or the wrong choice that the mother has made, and that she could have potentially been in that more glamorous Hollywood style life, rather than teaching her daughter to cha-cha-cha on the way to church. So lots of really interesting imagery here, a lot of it to do with the idea of memory. We could focus on the idea of the photograph and the capturing of that memory. We could focus on the idea of the ghost and the relics that's been used there, and also the use of Hollywood imagery such as Marilyn and the stamping stars from the wrong pavement. The tone in Before You Were Mine is actually really interesting, because we have a poet who is very, very uncertain about their own role in their parents' life and how she particularly feels about the decisions that her mother has made. There's a lot of insecurity. So, for example, there's a rhetorical question: the decade ahead of my loud, possessive yell was the best one, A. So this idea of she's reflecting and asking her mother these questions, that the decade before that she was born was the best one, and that might indicate a sense of uncertainty or a sense of unsure about her place in the world. There's certainly a sense of pride in her mother, in the sense of like her mother being this glamorous, inspirational figure. We have the idea of Marilyn, that comparison we talked about with imagery, and how the poet is referring to her mother as the most beautiful woman in the world, and the idea of teaching the dance steps, the fact that her mother is someone who's very learned, someone who's very able and capable. We also have this possessive nature. We have the title of the poem, and it's referred to in there as Before You Were Mine. That word mine is very significant because it's the idea of the possessive nature of a child, that this is my parents, and therefore you belong to me. And that's really significant to explore, how she feels that it's her mother belongs to her and she's the most important part of her life at that point. Structurally, there are some quite interesting things going on with Before You Were Mine. The first one I'd like to consider is, if we look at the first three stanzas, there is a consistent reference to time and the idea of this blurring of boundaries between different time periods. So the first stanza starts with I'm 10 years away, then we have I'm not here yet, and then the decade ahead. So that use of time is a consistent structural device that the poet is using to try and evoke this idea of time and blurring boundaries. One of the other structural features that's really interesting is we have a look at the rhyme scheme. There isn't a rhyme scheme present. Now, in the past when we talked about this, we talked about how rhyme tends to have something where the poets have time to think about it, time to reflect, time to construct their argument, and the sense of certainty perhaps that goes alongside that. Now, if we do not have that rhyme scheme, then what that might be indicating is that the poet is completely uncertain or doesn't have a concrete idea about what this is right. And that's reflected in things like the rhetorical questions that we see. The decade ahead of my loud possessive yell was the best one, A. She's asking her mother these questions. Whose bites on your neck, sweetheart? These sorts of questions that the poet is uncertain, the poet doesn't know the right answers here, so therefore the rhyme scheme might be a little bit more chaotic. We also have examples of enjambment. For example, in the last stanza we have the third line of the stanza, somewhere in Scotland before I was born. So this enjambment can consider a sort of muddled point of view. A lot of the enjambment that we have within the poem links to this idea of uncertainty, and it creates further questions throughout. So that could be indicating the poet's point of view and the person's perspective. One structural point we might kind of consider is the fact that she ends with the title "Before You Were Mine." That final choice of word "mine" is particularly important because we have the poet coming to a conclusion that you belong to me, and therefore that possessive pronoun is an important point for the poem to finish on. We could consider this as a sort of cyclical poem because we have the first stanza is to do with the women on the pavement, and it ends in a stanza about the mother and the daughter on the pavement, and it could be considered a parallel, or it could be considered cyclical as it goes and ends in the same scenario. However, there's going to be changes in development that occurs throughout that. So, like I say, there's some really interesting things to look at with structure, and there's some really interesting things we can link with the tone and the poet's attitude within the poem. Language-wise within the poem, we have a semantic field to do with glamour and to do with excitement and joy. So we've already spoken about the idea of Marilyn. We've already spoken about the stamping stars from the wrong pavement, both of which we could link into the idea of Hollywood and movie stars. We have a mention of fizzy movie tomorrows, which could suggest this opportunity that's offered to her mother. And likewise, we have sparkle and waltz and laugh in the final stanza, along with cha-cha-cha. There's mentions of dancing. There's lots of mentions of things like the 1,000 eyes in the ballroom. There's loads and loads of references to the glamorous lifestyle that the mother could lead if she had the opportunity without having a child. So there's lots and lots of references to that throughout, and they're worth delving into. If you want to be talking about these, we could link a few of these together and talk about that idea of a semantic field, a group of words all associated with the same thing. Alternatively, we can consider the idea of this idea of memory and the idea of sensory memories as well. So we've already spoken about the idea of relics. The shoes being relics now, like museum articles rather than items of clothing. We've talked about the ghost of a memory clattering across George Square. We could potentially also link in the idea as I see you now as clear as scent. So the idea of the poet can imagine being in this scenario and yet isn't there. It's a memory. It's something that's faded now. We had the fact that the poet wanted the bald girl from Portobello. It could suggest that the poet is a bit disappointed that her mother chose the life that she chose, which is ironic as well because she's proud of that and she's pleased at that, and we can link that to those rhetorical questions we talked about earlier with the decade ahead of my loud possessive yell was the best one, the poet is uncertain about her own role within this and where she fits in. Likewise, we could also consider the use of pronouns. The use of the consistent first person I tells us that this is a personal poem from the poet's point of view, and it's their perspective. We've got the use of the second person you. We know that this is a direct address to the mother. The use of the questioning, whose bites on your neck, sweetheart, shows that the poet is directly addressing this to her mother, and it's a direct question and a direct address to her to reflect on the choices that she's made throughout her life. Okay, once again for you to do, we have 2 essay questions. The first one is essay question just considering Before You Were Mine, just looking at the idea of the use of glamorous language, which would be a nice interesting one to have a look at. If you go back and have a look at the imagery and the language sections of this video, they'd be quite useful to support you there. The second one, looking at a comparison with Before You Were Mine and another poem of your choice. Again, now we're starting to build up these links and comparison poems from there. So we've done Walking Away, we have Mother Any Distance, and we have Follower, all of which have this parental relationship connection you could potentially be making. Have a look at them, see what you think, and then stay tuned and we'll have our today's film recommendation. Okay, today's film recommendation is a film that, when it was released, was actually a bit of a commercial flop, and it didn't do very well. It became one of the absolute classic films quite a long time after it was released. It's currently in the number one position on IMDb on their greatest ever films registered based on public views on that, and that is The Shawshank Redemption. It's an absolutely fantastic film based on a Stephen King novel of the same name. With fantastic performances from Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman. It's a really, really good, heartwarming story about friendship and about justice and about overcoming adversity. The crawling through the pipe sequence is been parodied many, many times, but it's a fantastic finale to the film. It's really, really good. I suggest you go and check it out. Until next time, I hope everyone's staying safe. We are going to be looking at Climbing My Grandfather next. So until then, stay safe.